We're going to read from chapter 21 of A Day of Rest by Edna Creekmore Carmen. And here is the drawing at the beginning of the chapter. Aunt Mary sat down in the rocker on the back porch as Cal strained the milk into gallon jars and then took the jars to the cellar. Susan sat on the edge of the porch and watched as Aunt Mary gradually fell asleep in the rocker. When Cal came up out of the cellar, he sat down by Susan and questioned her about going down to the mine. When Susan finished her story, Cal sat idly watching the fireflies flicker on and off in the garden beyond the fence while he thought about Bert and Jim. Where were they? Were they all right? Except for a light snore from Aunt Mary, all was quiet on the porch. Then the banging started. Susan went over to Aunt Mary and whispered in her ear, "Aunt Mary! Aunt Mary!" Aunt Mary turned her head toward Susan, but didn't open her eyes. She would be asleep again if Susan didn't hurry. "Aunt Mary! Aunt Mary!" Susan whispered desperately. "Someone is banging on the front door." Aunt Mary pushed herself up out of the chair with a groan. She was stiff and sore. She stood still until the pain eased up a bit. "Mr. McTay! Mr. Douglas McTay! Open up!" The banging on the front door was now accompanied by shouts. "Susan, you and Cal stay out of sight," Aunt Mary commanded before she walked into the house. Once in the kitchen, Aunt Mary walked directly to the large walk-in closet that backed on the closet in her bedroom. Since there was a connecting door from the kitchen closet to her own closet, it took only seconds for Aunt Mary to grab the man's robe that hung in the back of her closet. Susan knew that robe. Sewn into the folds of that blanket robe was a long pocket that concealed a sawed-off shotgun. "Open up in there. This is the law." "I'm coming," Aunt Mary answered angrily as she wrapped herself into the garment that was big enough to wrap around her twice. With the belt tied, the large pocket was directly in front. Aunt Mary tugged at the rope until the pocket was conveniently to her right before starting toward the front door. Cal thought he should watch to make sure nothing happened to Aunt Mary. So he slipped into the dining room and opened the door slightly so he could see the front door as Aunt Mary shuffled across the living room rug. Aunt Mary stopped at the table in the center of the room and lit the lamp before going on to the door. "What do you want?" she shouted as she neared the front door. "We want to see Douglas McTay," a voice that Susan could not recognize demanded. "He ain't here." "We'd like to see for ourselves," another strange voice stated. The second voice was rougher and coarser than the first. Aunt Mary pulled the shotgun part way out of the pocket with her right hand. With the left, she caught the muzzle of the gun and brought it up until it pointed directly at the center of the door. "Who is this?" "We're the law," it was the first voice. "You ain't no law, I know." "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Floyd McTay," another voice stated. Susan recognized the voice of Floyd McTay, the county sheriff. "Okay, Floyd McTay, I know who you are," Aunt Mary stated angrily. "What I want to know is why you are banging on our door at this time of night." "We want to see Douglas, ma'am." "He ain't here." "We'll believe that when we see for ourselves," the second voice growled. No one from the area would talk like that to Aunt Mary, Susan knew. "Please, ma'am, these are federal officers and they have a warrant." The sheriff hastened to intervene before Aunt Mary could object. For a second, Aunt Mary stood in silence facing the door. Then, shrugging her shoulders, She dropped the gun back into the pocket and reached for the bolt on the door. After releasing the bolt, she didn't open the door, but backed to the center of the living room, where she shouted that the door was open, and since they had a warrant, they might as well make themselves at home. The sheriff opened the door and pushed it back, allowing the two men with him to enter first. "Where is Douglas McTay at this time of night?" the taller of the two strangers asked, as the three men walked toward the tiny figure of Aunt Mary, wrapped in the voluminous robe. Susan easily recognized her dad's cousin Floyd, the county sheriff. He looked rather stern, standing there dressed in his official sheriff clothes and holding his hat with the large badge pinned on the front. The other two men were strangers. Their dark gray suits with the white shirts and blue ties were enough to tell Susan they were not from the area, even if their accent had not. No one wore suits in the summertime except strangers. The two men stood in the middle of the living room, holding their gray hats and staring around the room, waiting for Aunt Mary to answer their question. "He is out looking for the cows," Aunt Mary replied gruffly. Susan knew that wasn't true. The cows were at the barn being milked by Mrs. Weaver. Dad was out looking for Bert. But she was not surprised that Aunt Mary didn't tell the men where her dad had gone. One never told strangers anything more than something to stop them from asking questions. That wasn't lying, that was being careful. "It's rather late to be looking for cows." "If cows don't come up, you hunt them until you find them." "We came to see Douglas McTay," the shorter of the two men said. "But if he chooses to hide, then we will have to hunt for him." The sheriff held up his hands. "You have a warrant, it's true, but this is no way to go about serving it. Let's proceed in a civilized manner." The sheriff turned to Aunt Mary. "Aunt Mary, this is Mr. Lewis, special agent of the government. I will vouch for his credentials. With him is Mr. Waters, a deputy." Turning to the two men, the sheriff continued, "Mr. Lewis, Mr. Waters, Mrs. Mary McTay, Douglas McTay's cousin, who lives with him." The sheriff answered with a veiled warning in his voice. "Aunt Mary is also my cousin." Mr. Lewis bowed his head to acknowledge the introduction, but Mr. Waters ignored it, turning instead to Douglas's bedroom door. "What's that room?" "That is Douglas McTay's bedroom. You surely don't think he would lay in there and let a woman answer the door?" "He may be hiding under the bed for all I know," Mr. Waters said curtly. "Now, Mr. Waters, I agree with the sheriff. There is no point in our being insulting," Mr. Lewis objected. "I know this good lady is telling the truth. Mr. McTay is not here, but," he turned to Aunt Mary, "if you don't care, we will glance around a bit. It will ease Mr. Waters' mind." "I do care, but a lot of difference it will make to you," Aunt Mary accused the two federal agents. "We have to do our job, ma'am." The two men tramped into Douglas's bedroom. Susan could hear them knocking about in there, opening doors and then slamming them shut, and pulling out drawers and pushing them again with a bang. Aunt Mary turned angrily to the sheriff. "Floyd McTay, this is your party. Why ain't you in there poking around in other people's things while they ain't here to object, just like the rest of the scum? You have a warrant, you say." "Now, Aunt Mary," the sheriff responded gently, "this ain't my party. You know that. If you don't mind, I'll just sit here until they get through with their job." As he spoke, the sheriff seated himself in the big wooden rocker where Susan could just see his feet. "Make yourself at home, Sheriff. As you say, you have a warrant." Aunt Mary sat down stiffly in the other rocker, facing the sheriff, and she rocked in silence. As the men left Douglas's bedroom and walked toward the dining room, Susan and Cal fled to the kitchen. As the men entered the dining room, Susan and Cal darted into the deep closet and through the door at the opposite end into Aunt Mary's closet and on into Aunt Mary's room. In Aunt Mary's room, Cal opened the window wide and unfastened the screen, just in case the men started to search the bedroom. However, the searchers gave only a glance at the dining room and the kitchen before climbing the stairs to the attic. They were in the attic, tramping around, shoving boxes back and forth, when Susan heard the whisper, "Susan, Susan." Against the bright moonlit yard, she could see the dark silhouette of a man. The man had lifted the screen and was pushing a small, darker shape into the room. The small, dark shape moved forward into the room just as another small shape appeared next to the large shape. "Bert, Dad found you," Susan whispered joyfully. "Yeah, Dad found us because you came home the way I told you to," Bert responded to his sister gruffly. "I knew you could do it." All the fears were gone, all the pain forgotten. Bert was home. Susan smiled happily at her brother. "Who is in the attic?" Douglas asked abruptly as he heard the voice of a man. "I don't know," Susan responded quickly. "They are government agents," Cal added. "They said they were looking for you." "They probably belong to the car that is parked in the lane," Bert supplied, but Douglas shook his head. "No, that's Floyd McTay's car. He wouldn't be tramping around in the attic with me gone." "If that's the sheriff's car," Bert asked, "why did you park at the Weaver's house and want me to climb in the window? Floyd McTay is our cousin." "Floyd is also the sheriff. I am just being careful. I wanted to know whether Floyd is here on a social call or on official business before I showed my hand. I can't see his making a social call at this time of night." "The officers have a warrant, Mr. McTay," Cal said quietly. "They said it was for you, but the sheriff isn't doing any looking. He's sitting in the living room with Aunt Mary." "In the living room?" Douglas paused. "I could go in there and talk to him while the other men are in the attic, but if they came down while I was there, I'd be stuck." Douglas thought for a moment. "Cal, you and Jim go home. I don't want you mixed up in this whatever. Susan, you and Bert get into the bed. There's no point in you getting mixed up in it either." "But we haven't had supper yet," Bert objected. "You can eat after the officers leave. Right now, get in that bed and cover up as if you were asleep." "Aunt Mary won't let Bert sleep in her bed. He's all dirty," Susan objected. Douglas smiled at his daughter. "Now, Susan, Bert wiped his feet on the grass wet from the dew, so they're mostly clean, and he took a bath yesterday." "But his clothes are dirty." "I don't think he should strip. Aunt Mary would object more to a naked boy in her bed than a dirty one." "Enough fussing now. Both of you get in that bed. Cal, come on, climb out." Doug didn't expect either Bert or Susan to go to sleep so early without any supper, but it might prevent Bert from being questioned by the law officers. "I'm going down to milk the cows," Douglas added as he stepped back from the window. "If those men want to see me, they can come down to the barn." "Mom is milking the cows," Cal said as he climbed out the window. "Then I'd better hurry to help her," Douglas said quickly before he started to run toward the barn. Doug was anxious to see Margaret as well as get the milking done. On the drive up the mountain from Willow Creek, as Bert and Jim had talked about their kidnapping, Doug had figured out a way for Margaret to send Cal on to school, and he was anxious to tell her about it.